USAA knows dynamic duos can save the day, like superheroes and sidekicks or auto and home insurance. With USAA, you can bundle your auto and home and save up to 10%. Learn more and get a quote at usaa.com/bundle. Restrictions apply.
In the face of no information, everybody's argument is as good as anybody else's.
Exactly, right.
Well,
so and that's my fear, is that, like, it sounds like people want to, I mean, if my birds gets defunded, I don't know where we go. Right? Do we go in some default mode? Do we go back to states making decisions? I mean, it's a mess.
Yeah.
And I want people to recognize that what we have now, albeit imperfect, is better than the alternative.
You are tuned in to the FowlWeather Podcast, the forecast to your next successful hunt. Coming to you from the home office, Jack's Reef, New York.
We have a very special guest today, DrJim Dubovsky, who is retired from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Jim served as the Central Flyway representative for years and will detail the history behind duck season setting as part of our ongoing 2025 Data Stream series. The FowlWeather Podcast 2025 Data Stream series aims to get the good information brought to you across your wavelengths on your phone, in your truck, or on your computer, wherever you listen, in an effort to combat the massive amount of misinformation about waterfowl populations, waterfowl habitat, waterfowl surveys, and how that information is used in the decision-making process. But before we jump in with Jim, I want to introduce the FowlWeather Podcast Photographer of the Year. Last year we had Matt Mezowitz, a graduate student from the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point. Go check out Matt's work at thewildlookphotography.com. This year we welcome an artist local to Jack's Reef. Lori Mickelman's work can be found and purchased at littlepeacegallery.com. That's little, Little, Peace, Peace, gallery.com. As Lori calls her work, peaceful moments through nature's lens, sharing my love for birds and wildlife with others. Much of Lori's work is captured right down the road from the home office at Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge, but Lori travels everywhere with her camera and captures truly amazing photos across the country and world. Again, check her work out at littlepeacegallery.com. The link is also on our webpage at fowlweather.co, and then click on the About button. Okay, let's jump in with Jim. All right, today we welcome Jim Dubovsky. He's a retired U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as the Central Flyway representative. But he had a lot of hats, I think, before that. And Jim and I actually have a connection way back to, I think, Mississippi State University. We weren't there at the same time. I feel like maybe I'm like a half generation away from Jim. And we'll talk about our backgrounds here in a bit. But I think I want to do something here that's maybe a little bit long as an intro. And Jim's just going to have to hang out for a second. We chatted ahead of time. But this is going to be a little bit long, but I think it'll make sense at the end, right? Like and this is kind of the connection we all have as waterfowl biologists and the things we work on. So I'm from rural Western New York. I've hunted my whole entire life and had some experiences with duck and goose hunting in my teens, but I only really found duck hunting when I moved to Central New York. It was kind of an area, rich in wetlands, but also an area that was really storied in kind of the history in wetland loss. Years later, my wife and I moved back to the area, and now she works with Ducks Unlimited, and she was kind of neck deep in wetland restoration of the region. And since my time here in Central New York during my undergraduate time in forestry school until now, the wetlands have really come back to life, and the ducks are more abundant than ever here. Regionally, moist soil wetlands and moist soil units that DU helps support on public land have provided abundant waterfowl habitat and hunting opportunities. I'd say those well beyond what federal and state dollars could have done alone. Okay, so what I don't want the listeners to do, and Jim can tell you probably when we talk to him here from traveling across the country and talking with people, is don't get too excited about the Atlantic Flyway. It's not the Mississippi Flyway. It's not the Central Flyway. It's not the Pacific Flyway. And I call Jack's Reef home, and we love it. but the ducks aren't what they are elsewhere. We live halfway between the university I work at and the marshes we hunt. We love our ducks and all the people that have worked so hard to bring them back to us in our small part of the world. The point is, in between leaving New York, this is a long story, Jim. Sorry, we'll introduce you at some point. But between leaving New York and coming back to New York, my wife and I spent many days chasing that new duck job. And that all said, during that journey, our pursuits eventually landed us at Mississippi State, which our guest has some experience with. Again, today we welcome Jim Dubovsky to the FowlWeather Podcast. Jim is retired now from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but was the Central Flyway representative for many years. And we're going to get into what that means soon here. Jim, I just outlined a bit of my background in very brief, well, maybe not as brief form as listeners would want, but and it's how my wife and I ended up in the duck world and ended up, with careers in waterfowl. So how did you end up, just as an intro, and welcome to the FowlWeather Podcast, first of all, Jim. Sorry, welcome.
Well, thanks, Mike. Glad to be here. And like you, I grew up in a rural area, a little further west than you did. I grew up in northeastern lower peninsula of Michigan. And like most rural kids, I grew up hunting and fishing with my dad and uncles. And we had a 1,900 acre lake that was only a few miles away from our house. And it was more of a marsh than a lake, really. A great waterfowl area, actually highlighted in Miles Pierney's book on the waterfowl of Michigan. And every year I went out and hunted with my dad, hunted waterfowl with my dad. And even after I graduated from high school and left home on my various adventures, I'd come back every fall and we'd always hunt together. And it just became part of my growing up period. It was just the thing that I did. When I graduated from high school, again from that small town, I went to big Michigan State University down in East Lansing. And I initially went down there to become an engineer. But after a little over a year, it just really wasn't doing it for me. And I always liked being in the outdoors. And I got to talking with some people there and realized that, oh, yeah, there are jobs in biology and wildlife management. And I actually got hooked up with Dr. Harold Prince, who taught waterfowl ecology at Michigan State at the time. And in working with him, he told me about this place in Canada where they did a lot of waterfowl and wetland research. It's called the Delta Waterfowl Research Station. And he got me to apply for a fellowship there. And so at the end of my, I guess halfway through my senior year, really, I accepted a fellowship to go up there. And that station is near Portage la Prairie, Manitoba in Canada, for folks that aren't aware of it. But it at the time was a premier station for students from all over the world, really, to come and study waterfowl and wetland ecology. And so I got to spend 6 months up there working with various students and scientists on waterfowl and wetland related projects. And that really solidified my desire to work with waterfowl. That was the critical point, I think. Those 6 months up in Canada, I just realized that, hey, there are people that do this for a living, it's what I wanted to do. So I came back, finished up my bachelor's at Michigan State, and then I was looking to go on to graduate school. And I spent all my time really in the north. I hadn't spent any time in wintering areas. And at Mississippi State, there was this new professor down there named Rick Kaminsky, who got down there in 1983 and was offering some research assistantships. And so I applied down there, and he accepted me, and I went down there and did my master's work. And then apparently he didn't get too fed up with me, so he let me stay on for a PhD after I finished up my master's. So I was actually at Mississippi State from 1984 to 1990 and got both my master's and doctorate degrees there.
So we're a few years apart there because I was there, my wife and I both, as I noted, 2008 to like 2010. We get confused about dates. I talked with my friends that are part of that, Heath Agee and other folks that were there during the same time, James Callicutt and folks, and we always get confused about when I showed up and when I left. But we sold a house in Maine where I was at. We actually left. This is what wildlife biologists do, Jim. We abandoned a house that we bought 8 months before. And you can't leave a house without having some extra insurance or anything, right? And we just left it to drive to Mississippi, and we had a wholly vacated house that we left with a real estate agent to sell it. And luckily it sold like 3 months later. We lost $8,000 in the whole thing, which was not a bad deal in total for only owning it for 8 months. But it was a great jump. And you probably feel the same of those years down there. What was the hunting like when you were when I'm guessing that you did a fair bit of hunting around? It's in hill country. What was it like during those days?
Well, I spent most of my time out in the Delta. That's where my master's research was. And I did get out and hunt some. The catfish ponds out there held a lot of diving duck species primarily. So I got to hunt those some. Also hunted Noxubee Refuge, which is nearby to Mississippi State.
Yeah, very familiar.
But as you know, as a student, you spend a lot of time on your research too. So you try to find those times when you can get out and hunt. But at times it was, few and far between. But I did enjoy my time down there and certainly got a feel for the wintering portion of the waterfowl cycle too. So.
For sure. And what's really funny is how little that changed from when I was there many years later. A bunch of students had actually, paid in a little bit of money and leased a bunch of catfish ponds. Because as graduate students, you don't lease good ground, you lease catfish ponds, right? And so we'd go out, like I went with them sometimes, and you shoot shovelers and bluebills and the odd gadwall and stuff like that, and you make kebabs out of them and marinate the heck out of them, and they all kind of taste the same. And then you go to Noxubee once in a while and you shoot some timber ducks here and there, but for the most part. And then there were draw systems by the time I was there, so there were some really good puddle duck hunts, and we actually did shoot some mallards. That's mostly a private land thing down there. But the struggle was real for graduate students and postdocs, which sounds about kind of like what you had. So,
yeah. Fortunately, we both had Kaminsky as an advisor, though, and he had some connections. He had one landowner who was a friend I know who had some land right off of Noxubee Refuge, and he developed it for waterfowl hunting. And I didn't get to spend many times out there, but boy, when I spent times hunting there, they were great.
Yeah, I had the same thing, and he had some friends out in the Delta that he took me out on. And there's this very funny photo of us, because I'm like a relatively seasoned duck hunter by the time I get down there, right? And Rick takes me out, and he's like, Mike, you need to sit right here. And like he puts me in like a layout line, and there's like he tucks me in with camo and stuff, and then takes a picture of me huddled up in there. And we shot our mallards, and then he takes a picture of me like I'm laying in bed with like my 4 greenheads and stuff. But Rick did take care of his kids and sent them on to great jobs over the years. So
yeah.
And Jim, for the listeners, and the title says it, like what we're going to hit on is the history of kind of the frameworks of hunting seasons and such, which you have a lot of history with yourself. Not to age you too much, but I'm going to go with you have sage advice. I hope that's not offensive to you, Jim.
Well, it's one of the better compliments or better things people have said about my tenure. So,
well, what I like is you're not the only retired Fish and Wildlife Service that's still there. Like folks actually contract after they retire to continue to work to help the service out because they're so damn dedicated to what they've done over the years. But what I want to get into first is like we introduced you as the central flyway representative, right? And I don't think people know, quite what that role is with the kind of flyway technical section in the Flyway Council. So what was your role in that position through time? And I know you had other stuff in between, that got you there. Like you don't just jump to a, central flyway representative working for Fish and Wildlife Service. But let's hit on that that role and in what that is with Fish and Wildlife Service and how it plays into waterfowl conservation and management on this continent.
Sure. Yeah, because Central Flyway Representative is a pretty nondescript title. I mean, Flyway Representative is, okay, what do you represent? And, but essentially what the job entails was that I was the official U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service liaison between the service and the states and provinces in the Central Flyway. So we're talking Alberta, Saskatchewan, Northwest Territories, the 10 states in the U.S. Flyway, and the states of Mexico that fall within the Flyway as well. And really what I did was work between the service and the states on any issue related to migratory birds that either the service had or the states had. So if the service had a regulation or policy that they were coming out with, I would work with the states to help them understand it and to implement, any ramifications of those issues. And likewise, if the Flyway came to me with some concerns about what the federal government or what the migratory bird program was doing, then I would convey that to my superiors in the Fish and Wildlife Service. So really, it is a liaison position. And the way the Flyway reps, because there are 4 of them, one for each Flyway. There's only 4 of us, and the way we like to describe it is that we influence just about anything that goes on, but we decide nothing. So
right. It's good.
So we're constantly talking with the states and our leadership on any issues regarding regulations, monitoring, policy, you name it. That we were the conduit between the two, so that you had one individual that could represent both sides of things, instead of getting messages crossed by different people talking to different people, between the states and the service. So that was essentially my job as a Flyway rep. And mostly what I really spent a lot of time on was the regulations process that, as you know, we develop federal frameworks every year, and then working with the states to make sure that whatever seasons they wanted to have would fit within those frameworks, season lengths, bag limits, zoning guidelines, so on and so forth.
Yeah, for sure. And one example that comes to mind for me is when I was in Maine and our constituency was really asking for, a more liberal woodcock season. And I went to our Atlantic Flyway representative and said, look, this is a thing I kind of have to bring forward to you guys. I got to go through the bag limit thing, and look back at when it was a different bag limit, because it's not days, days aren't as much of a thing as bag, right? So they wanted more birds because the population had been up a little bit and there was no indication that harvest was driving anything. And he's like, that's not going to go anywhere. He basically said, this is where we're at. We're working on a woodcock harvest strategy, and, still on their migratory birds, right? Woodcock are. And I was like, okay, but my constituency is asking for this, so I have to move it forward. And we kind of had this mutual discussion where I was going to bring it forward and it was pretty much going to get squashed. And we all knew that, right? But we needed that person in the middle between hey, we're working on a woodcock harvest strategy for Mississippi Atlantic Flyways, and your constituency wants you to bring this thing forward. And as the person who represents the people of the state of Maine, I kind of had to listen to them, take what they said, try to move it, knowing it wasn't going to kind of go anywhere. I mean, that's a little very specific example, but there's lots of those types of things that you mediated between states and the federal government over your time, I'm guessing, Jim, right?
Yes. Yeah. And I'll just give you a quick example because like you said, your example was woodcock, mine is mourning doves, but in Texas, they wanted to change their regulations. And so I got with our mourning dove special, or our dove specialist, and said, well, this is what they want to do. Can we get them there? And the specialist said, well, okay, we're going to need this kind of information. And so you're going to need to do this type of survey or whatever, and then we'll determine whether or not that has any impact on the dove resource. And so then I went back to the state and said, okay, this is what you need to do to satisfy what we feel are the information requirements for moving forward with this. So, similar type of thing. But that was my job.
But data driven, I think for the listeners, that's the biggest thing. Like nobody's willy-nilly like grabbing information and like just anecdotal information and making decisions. It's all strongly data and science driven in decision making, right?
Yeah, exactly. And if we don't have the data, is there a way to get it? And if not, it will probably die. But if there is a way to get it, we'll work with them. So
yeah. And that's happened a lot. I mean, stuff's been brought forward, like the 3 pintail thing and other things that have happened recently. It's not that the Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't work with folks. It's just, the information has to be there kind of to get it done. So a little bit in short, because this could get messy, is a little context on kind of the federal process for season setting, right? And how that from tech section to council and wherever your role is, you kind of covered what your role is, but like a little bit of the step through of the process of season setting. And Jim, did you retire before the 2-year cycle or whatever we're on now? Right? We're not on an annual cycle. We're like on a delayed cycle now. So
yeah, I was still there when we were on the delayed cycle. Now,
okay.
Yeah, okay. We're still making it. Well, at least as I understand it, we're still making annual decisions, but it's a year out.
It's a year out, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's not the current year's information we're using. It's the previous year's information on making decisions.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah. So we have a number of monitoring programs for all our migratory bird species out there, and like you said, it's data driven, and there's a reason for that. It's because decisions that are based on data are much easier to defend than decisions based on people's beliefs or whatever. We have these programs, and this is, I guess, maybe going. It's not quite the script that I was thinking about, but
you're good. You're good.
We have these programs, and I wanted to go into those a little bit because you at one point you wanted to know about some of the history of this, and I don't know if you still want me to go into that or not, how we got to where we are, but. We have things like the May survey. We have waterfowl harvest surveys. We have, at one point we had the dove survey. We have woodcock surveys. All that, all those different surveys are meant to assess the status of migratory birds in any given year. And then based on that information, historically, what we looked at, and we kind of looked at things somewhat in isolation, we determined how much harvest pressure we thought that the migratory bird resource could support. Okay, and so we would take in all that information, and within the service, we would develop some preliminary ideas about what we thought seasons might look like. And the states did the same thing through their, we shared all this information with them as soon as it was available. You're all familiar with the waterfowl status reports, the old trend reports, the harvest survey reports. We get that information out, as quickly as we can into the hands of folks. So the states, through their commission meetings and through their internal discussions with their agencies, they come up with their thoughts about what regulation should look like. And then at some point in the process, then we get together and we start talking about where we agree and where we disagree. And on points where we disagree, we try to determine which arguments are stronger in terms of the data. Again, who's making the best inferences from the data? Is it the states and the flyways, or is it the federal government?
So just to take a break, we're kind of going back in history to kind of before. I mean, it's data driven, but it's not model structured decision making driven, right?
Right, not what I've just described. This is
Okay.
kind of the way it used to
Because
be.
there's kind of like a break in how we did things there at some point, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And if you want to get into that now, I could.
No,
I'd be
we'll
glad to
jump
do it.
into that a little bit later. We'll scratch the surface of it now because there's a whole bunch of like, I mean, Jim, there were 92-day seasons with 25 ducks per day
Right.
at one point, and we're nowhere near that for different reasons than
Yeah.
that we can discuss. But
Yeah, there
just
was
the general kind of like what I'm talking about is like that. This is interesting. So the general process was more like, smoke-filled rooms and strongest opinions at one point.
Yes, and as you know, going all the way back, it really has been an evolution, and it continues to evolve. But as you know, prior to the early 1900s, the states had jurisdictions over waterfowl regulations. The federal government was not involved. And so they would set their own regulations based on what their biologists and the few federal waterfowl biologists that were around back then felt, the could be supported by the resource. And it wasn't until the Migratory Bird Treaty was signed in 1916, and then a couple of court cases in Canada and the US, where the federal government got control over the regulation setting process. And but even in those early years, we didn't have monitoring programs, not like we do today. There were some biologists out in the field, and they saw what was going on, and they made their best decisions as to what things should look like. And it really wasn't until the 1920s and 30s when we started banding birds en masse, and we started doing winter surveys of waterfowl that we even had much information at all at large scales to determine what was going on with duck populations. And so those early regulations were really quite simple. I mean, you look back in 1916 and 17, and you essentially had northern regulations and southern regulations. And as time went on and we started getting more information, they got to be a little more regional. There were some areas that had different regulations, and then, it got down to, in some cases, individual state regulations that were different from other areas. But as time went on and we got more and more information from our monitoring programs, we were able to start assessing that information and coalesce more around different groups of critters that we could assess the status of, and then decide, okay, together with our state partners, what should the seasons look like? And that all really happened in 1948, and that was the first year that regulations were set on a flyway basis. And
then I think, there's also that big split, and we'll get into it. We're gonna take a break here, Jim, and a quick ad break, but that's like super insightful regarding kind of the early history, of duck harvest. And then, we got to the 60 days and in 60 ducks in, oh goodness, I don't want to get this wrong, 1997?
Yeah,
was it 97?
Right. Yep.
And we stayed there, and I feel like there's a big split too between, as far as how decision making kind of happened maybe after that point in the kind of advent of adaptive implementation of adaptive harvest management. So I think we'll dig into that next. We'll take a quick break here and come right back with you. Beckman Game Calls has it dialed in. If you want a duck call that is adjustable to your air pressure and sounds like a duck, this is it. I've blown a ton of different calls in my life, but this one is the real deal. Look, we don't endorse just anything. We are only going to put forward a call that works. The Edison by Chris Beckman of Beckman Game Calls, yeah, this beauty sounds like a duck. I only know of one published research paper focused on what makes a duck call sound like a duck. Go look me up, and you will see that colleagues and I have the only paper published in scientific literature about what makes a duck call sound like a duck. For sure, Chris Beckman did his homework, and this call sounds like a duck. This guy knows how to make a duck call, period. But don't just take my word for it. Here's the proof. First, a hen recording, and then the Edison in the big woods of Arkansas. Visit them today at BeckmanGameCalls.com. The Farmland Group is your one-stop shop for real estate brokerage, consulting, management, lending, and appraisal across Arkansas, Mississippi, Missouri, Louisiana, Georgia, Tennessee, and growing. Contact them today at FarmLG.com. Hey, I'm telling you, do not hesitate because these folks are busy buying, selling, and providing consulting and management strategies that build value into your portfolio and your land. So get in the queue today. Get on their radar. Get on their books. Man, y'all won't be disappointed. Contact the Farmland Group today at FarmLG.com. That's FarmLG.com. How many days have you had empty skies over the duck blind? Your property can be more with Wildlif strategies. It is no secret that hiring a consultant, an expert in managing water, woods, and fields, an expert in duck food, an expert in hunting pressure management, hiring a consultant yields better habitat for the critters you chase. Less empty skies, more quality days of field, more smiles for miles with family and friends. If that's your game and goal, contact Ryan Delaney at ryan@farmlg.com for a site visit. And hey, here's the deal. I'm filled up for summer 2025 with clients up north, but if our northern friends have a property in need of some love, contact me at Dr. Mike at FowlWeather.co for a summer 2026 site visit. All right, folks, welcome back. And Jim, thanks for the details on kind of some of the early history. We're certainly at a different time when it comes to waterfowl season setting than there were very liberal years, restrictive years before. What we're in now is 60 days and 6 ducks for quite a while. We're going to have another podcast that details kind of the real deep guts of adaptive harvest management. And we're really working on getting some experts on here. We'll see if we can snag them or not. If not, it's me, and I got to do all the homework, which is a good time. But I'd really like, when we jump back in here, we'll get back into some of the early history, very liberal seasons. But I'd like to hear some of your maybe early experience as a hunter with season setting. And then your early years as a biologist, kind of working through the ranks and onto your years with Fish and Wildlife Service. So maybe from a hunter perspective rather than a biologist perspective, like seeing the landscape and places you hunted and how all that laid out in front of you, Jim.
Well, I guess early on as a hunter, not knowing how really regulations were set when I was a teenager and everything, you kind of just took it on faith that, whatever the regulations were there to benefit hunters, but also maintain the resource. And I really, even though I went through a waterfowl program through my entire college career, you learn things about the May survey and harvest surveys and banding and so on, but you really don't know how they work. And it wasn't until I hired on as an assessment biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, it was my first job with them, where you really start diving into the data and understand how things are done. And to be honest with you, it took me probably a full year to understand the databases, how they're used, what their limitations are, and how they should be used appropriately. It's not a simple thing. And the biologists who do that work go through a lot of gyrations to try and make sure that not only is the data collected is the best that it can be collected, but it's also analyzed appropriately. And so at that point, I understood more about how the season setting worked, the information that went into it, and could see why regulations were set the way they were in some portions of the country and maybe not in others. Because populations are different, information can be different, and so on. So I guess my understanding as a hunter really was aided by a deeper understanding of the information that goes into the decision-making process.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, is that I think a lot of, people across duck country USA don't realize the kind of level of expertise, the passion of these people, and the kind of the learning that goes into these roles beyond kind of the university level. In our program, I do my best to kind of meet people like you and others and kind of get into the guts of how it works and talk about realities, get out of the books and be like, okay, so here's what the book says and here's how it functions, right? But the reality is everybody's working damn hard every damn day to, ensure that information going into the decision-making process is as good as it can be, all the time. So
yeah,
really respect that.
Absolutely.
Jim.
Yeah.
So a little bit early in our history, we had these really liberal seasons. Even 92-day seasons and 25 ducks per day. I kind of went back and dug around into, it was like Mississippi flyway stuff, and it was specifically like Arkansas's seasons. Before 1918, there might not even been limits in some places at all. But there were hunting clubs. I went back to in prep for this. I went back to, it's called Lore and Legend of Long Point. It's from Long Point, Ontario, and there's a whole chapter on the Long Point Company. And in the 1800s, hunting clubs and companies had like field bylaws restricting shooting in the spring, restricting hours of shooting, and all of this kind of like built out of market hunting days where folks started to see that we're going way back, right, Jim? So I'm not asking you to recall this because I don't know that you were even born yet. But people recognized that unlimited shooting was not sustainable, right?
Right.
And then we hit years when seasons go from 60 days to 30 days the next. Like literally from a 61-day season to a 30-day season. And then even back to 80 days, like 10 years later, like creeping up and then jumping to 80 days. And it seems like a lot of messing around with seasons. So I think you kind of got into like how decisions were made back in those days, like the 30s and 40s. But I kind of want to know, like, and speculate if you want, do you think we were actually like, shooting too many ducks, then saving ducks? Like, it seems like a lot of jockeying around that, given our current knowledge of how duck harvest affects populations, might not have been necessary, and maybe a burden on hunters to jump around that much too and change seasons. But just feel free to kind of speculate on that.
Yeah, no, and there's a term that we used a lot back in the day when I was starting out, and it was called chasing populations with regulations. And essentially, what we had until we had developed our databases to a point where we could really fully integrate them and better understand the demographics of waterfowl, a lot of the information we had was largely just about abundance of birds. And depending on the year and the area and where people were looking for birds, those abundances could vary dramatically. And so I don't think that they were necessarily bad decisions, but they were relatively uninformed decisions in terms of understanding what was going on with waterfowl. Like years where the prairies were dry. Well, we didn't have a lot of surveys to understand, did those birds just not exist or did they go somewhere else? Until we had more comprehensive surveys to understand that, okay, when prairies are dry, at least a proportion of them moved to other areas, and we counted them elsewhere. So the population fluctuations weren't necessarily as big as perhaps some of the earlier observers who had limited opportunities to see birds would actually observe them. So I think that kind of characterized the very early years, but even again, until we could start integrating the information across our banding programs, harvest surveys programs, and population surveys, we still tended to look at the abundance of birds every year and whether they went up and down and what kind of regulations we should have. And if populations were high, we'd be liberal. If populations were low, then we'd be more restrictive. Really, and this may be jumping ahead just a little bit, what really assisted all that was the advent of computers and getting them into biologists' hands, and all the statisticians and biometricians who developed all the coding and everything so that we could start integrating all this information more fully. It wasn't until that point, and I would argue that would be in the 70s and 80s, that we could better understand the demographics of birds and maybe not be as reactionary as we had been.
Yeah, and I think that's what folks don't understand is they look back and they're like, well, we used to react to these things, and when the population declined in the 80s, we ratcheted way back, and then when it increased in the 90s, we increased, and then now we haven't been adaptive. We went into adaptive harvest management, but we haven't been adaptive. That's the comment, right? But the reality is that the way that data comes in and the way we understand how populations react to harvest has changed dramatically. And so just speak to that a little bit, I think, like that kind of transition period, because I think you kind of lived through the low years to the liberal years, and then were part of the, Fish and Wildlife Service and flyway system during that. So I think you're as good a person to speak to that as anybody of how that kind of changed during that time.
Yeah, well, a lot of it goes back to a couple very contradictory hypotheses about how birds respond to the environment and to harvest. And this was how we developed the initial adaptive management process, is that there was a very strong camp that thought that harvest mortality was completely additive to other mortality that occurs out there, and another camp that said, no, it's largely, if not completely, compensatory, that those birds that we shoot, most of them would have died anyway because there's not enough habitat to support them.
So I do need to just take 1 second, because this is just a point that a lot of people, like additive compensatory, we talk about it all the time. But the idea with additive is that when you shoot a bird, it would not have died from natural causes or anything else. It would have lived that year instead. And 100% compensatory means that for every bird you shoot, it would have died anyway, right? And
That's absolutely correct.
And we're probably somewhere in between, right?
Yes.
We know we're somewhere in between. So I just wanted to clarify for listeners, additive compensatory for you, Jim. So sorry for interrupting you.
No, that's fine. I'm glad you did that. And the other big idea out there was whether production on the breeding grounds was more density independent or density dependent. That if you have more birds crowded into an area, resources are limited, so they're going to recruit less, versus with density independent, it really doesn't matter how many birds you have. There's enough resources out there that they're going to recruit at the same rate regardless. So those were the two major contradictory hypotheses that were out there. So what we did in the adaptive harvest management process was that, look, we really don't know which of these are correct. Let's develop models that incorporate both of those ideas. And then we will let the data come in each year on abundance, survival rates, and so on. And the data will tell us which of those models is more correct, recognizing that none of them are absolutely correct. The old adage, all models are wrong, some are useful. But the idea was to try and diffuse some of this angst between the camps of compensatory versus additive hunting, really. And we thought that the best way to do that was make those hypotheses compete against each other, and the information that we collect through our very good monitoring programs will help us decide which is the best way to go, and we would then develop regulations accordingly.
Yeah. And another very important point of this that took me a long time to recognize, and now I teach it to my students, is that the Fish and Wildlife Service, since adaptive harvest management has been put in place, has not been sued by anti-hunters, because it is a solid, objective decision-making model based on the best available data out there. If you're in a smoke-filled room, just being the loudest person and having a decision come out of that, you can get sued over your season and declining populations, say black ducks or something like that. That never actually came to court, but it sounded like Fish and Wildlife Service, somebody caved on that and reduced the black duck season at some point in that process. And, that took decades to come back to 2 black ducks. And we haven't seen any impact of going from 1 black duck to 2 black ducks in the bag. Not to sidebar this a little bit, but the legal portion of this is relatively important as well in understanding that these are justifiable and science-based decisions that aren't easily, you can't easily punch holes in them for the most part, Jim, right?
Right. And that's one of the things I think we were always very proud of, was that when the service got sued on an issue, typically it wasn't based on the biological information, because we had that down. With our programs, we could defend the decisions we made. Where we typically got in trouble was if we tried to bypass a certain process through the Administrative Procedures Act or something like that. That's where we were more vulnerable. But I was proud to say, in my 30 years with the Fish and Wildlife Service, we were never sued over a biological issue and lost. And that's, of course, very important to us and our budgets, because the less time you spend in court, the more time and resources you can spend out doing the things that we want to do and will benefit the hunters and society through waterfowl and wetland management.
Yeah, that's a great comment. I mean, I always go back to how important the duck hunters are in this equation. I come from the Atlantic Flyway, Jim. You're in the Central Flyway. Stuff's really liberal. There's tons of ducks, and we're like megalopolis. Everybody thinks the whole thing is New York City. It's not too far off, but we're not horrible people, believe it or not. There's a bunch of us rural folks that are still a bunch of rednecks out there shooting ducks and shooting deer and dealing with predators and all that jazz on the landscape. So don't throw us under the bus. But I always do get into the argument with folks of, we're way too conservative over here in general, and we just light ourselves up for lawsuit and things like that, because the comment always is, well, we have to take care of the resource first. And I'm like, yeah, but the resource is inextricably linked to the people that have supported the resource. So at some point, we got to figure out how to bring the people component into this. And I really applaud the North American Waterfowl Management Plan recent revisions for putting in waterfowl, wetland habitat, and people as the three-legged stool. But I still think we've done a damn bad job of grabbing the people component. We're getting there. But I feel like we're wobbly on 2 legs still, right? Like, we know how to do those two, but like that people component and looping it back, right? Because in the decision-making process for harvest, I don't see people in there yet, right? Like, at what point do we restrict it so much that we lose people, that we lose funding and support? And so where does that leave us? I don't think that we should continue to harvest at 60 days with 6 ducks if it's at the detriment of the population long term. But is there I'm going to go with this. I like to say, shoot them through the bottom. Like, right now we're at a low population, Jim, and I'm like, can we just shoot them through the bottom, come out the other side, have no real impact on the population, sustain our duck hunting culture, our duck hunters, and the ducks will be fine. And I don't know how many times we've done that. I think lots of times we get scared and we ratchet back. So I'll let you, I think that's a lot for you to feed on, Jim, right there.
Yeah. Well, one thing I will mention is that as I was at the end of my career, we were trying to do a better job of understanding what the hunters want out there. And I'll admit, for many years, we were focused on what was going on with the birds and not necessarily the hunters. We didn't understand our hunters well at all. And there were some surveys toward the end of my career that tried to get more at what the hunters felt was a desirable experience. How far did were they willing to travel? How many birds did they like to see in the bag? What type of season length? So I think there are some inroads on that. But I also know that we were struggling with how to formally incorporate that into a decision-making process. The other thing that I always came up again as a service employee was we were answerable not only to the hunters out there, but there are a whole lot of other people that use the resource, and we need to find out, how many birds the hunters can take, but how many birds other people also want to satisfy whatever experiences they get from the resource. And frankly, in a lot of cases, they can contribute a lot of resources into waterfowl or migratory bird habitat and so on. And so they shouldn't be discounted either. So it is kind of a balancing act to try and determine how far you should push the system before another part of the system gives, if you will.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I think we still continue. I think we're all working towards it. We continue to struggle with incorporating that and kind of like a feedback loop, type answer. And, that whole thing of churn, and where there's so many people that enter and duck hunt one year and then don't duck hunt again, and understanding why they show up and, why they leave and things like that. From the FowlWeather Podcast perspective, what I think is going on, speculating, is that there's a really good push of birds. There's nothing else going on in somebody's life, and their buddy's like, hey, we got ducks, come out and hunt with us. And they buy a duck stamp, they buy their license, and they go hunt one day. Right. So I think like big pushes of ducks at certain times and grabbing buddies to, come out for a hunt for the year. Those are like the one in and out. There's also people that just go opening day and then don't go again the rest of the season. But, understanding that motivation for people to be out there and to contribute is a big thing. And like you and I, like we're just, we identify as duck hunters. And I think what everybody's like, I don't want more people out there. I'm like, no, I want way more people out there. I just want somehow for us to diffuse the number of people and the pressure and the disturbance and all that stuff that goes with duck hunting as well. So
yeah, and that's an issue too. And I agree with you completely. We need to better understand all that stuff. What motivates the hunters in any given year, and just because they go one year and they don't the next, does that mean we've lost them? Or, do they come back? How often do they come back? How can we incorporate that information into our decision-making process as well? All very important. But going back to something you said earlier about the duck clubs and how important they felt it was to have rest days in order to maximize their hunting experience. They learned very early on that, yes, waterfowl need some places and some times to rest. And, that's one of the things that I was a little bit concerned about with, again, to satisfy duck hunters because they want to hunt where they want to and when they want to. There's, just been a proliferation of zones and split seasons and everything else. And I challenge anyone to go back and look at 30 or 40 years ago, how many days in a typical bird's annual trek from north to south they were exposed to hunting pressure, and there were a lot of breaks in there. You look at it today, there aren't very many breaks. The birds are essentially under some pressure somewhere their entire trip north or their entire trip south each year.
Yeah, and I'm very much for, providing as much opportunity to people as long as it's quality opportunity, right?
Mm-hmm.
But once birds get driven into small spaces and don't move from them, it's not good for the bird. It's not good for hunting. Then that's another part of the Fowl Weather Podcast is we're producing a 7-day migration forecast for each flyway, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to say like, hey, if you're in Arkansas, Thursday's your day, Wednesday's your day, Saturday's your day. Like if you're a weekend warrior, this is your weekend. You should probably get out there. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we're trying to do is say, you don't have to go to your duck blind every single day.
Yeah.
Right? Like you can eat breakfast at home. You can pick your days. I am hunting half the days I used to and shooting twice as many ducks as I used to.
No. Yeah.
Using our migration algorithm. So, I mean, I've got it super fine tuned into my local area. Like when I blow it out to like the bigger region, it's a little harder to like, get a sense for everybody just because I've got it tuned in for here. But the point is, I feel like more so, and Jim, you can speak to this. I don't feel like people went every day. When we had 10 times, I don't know, did we have 10 times as many duck hunters? I don't know how many we had, maybe 5 times.
Yeah, probably more like 5 times. Yeah.
I think people went like opening day. It was like a tradition, or they went Thanksgiving, or they went Christmas. Yeah. But it wasn't like, millions and millions of duck hunters were going, 45 days of a 60-day season, or going 30 days of the whole entire 30-day season. I think culturally we've changed to a thing where, I don't know, maybe you can just work on your phone when you're in the duck blind too much or something. But I think that pressure combined with all the zones has really, increased the duck behavior to a large degree. I think that's something, as you noted, I think we're struggling with nowadays. That's different than when you started duck hunting.
Yeah, I can recall opening weekend. It was amazing how many hunters were out there. But you got into, the middle of the first week and beyond that, and it really didn't, where I hunted, you didn't have a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
I don't think that that's the case, is particularly in the areas that are good anymore.
Yeah, for sure. So we're right back to like, we're in, 60 days, 6 ducks since 1997. And, that was from 97. We had this experience of like a big habitat change. We had a lot of wet that led us to kind of that 1997 period, like a boom years in the prairies. But like, we're back to kind of what everybody thinks is like a dry period. It's at least dry for the seasonal wetlands, right? Our semi-permanents and permanents are still out there. Since the late 90s, the prairies, at least the Coteau region, never really dried up, right? All those lakes, right. This is one thing people don't think about, is all those lakes that flooded into each other. I worked in Northeast South Dakota in 1998, and there were, you can still go to Google Maps and look, there's like 5-6 lakes with different names, and they're all one lake. Right. Yeah. They're all flooded into each other. But like, we're into a period, at least drying wise in the fields and such, that the ephemeral kind of wetlands are gone. So a little bit of speculation on your part, if you feel like it habitat wise, kind of compared to the 1980s to where we are now, the reports you're hearing, how bad are we? And, where do you think we're going kind of harvest regulation wise? And if you feel like that's an unfair question, just tell me, but feel free to speculate too. You're retired. Nobody can fire you.
Yeah. And that is one nice thing about being retired, is I don't have to worry about as much in the way of repercussions from folks, that I work for either. So,
but you still need, but I see you as a person that's still going to be fair to the question, right? You're not going to wildly speculate. So I appreciate that.
No. But one thing I was wondering if you'd allow me, Mike, because I don't know if people understand this. Yeah, we've been in fairly liberal regulations for quite some time now. But one thing that I still heard a lot was people still blistered over the steep restrictions that we had in the late 1980s. So I know you had that in some of the initial questions that you had or thoughts that you had sent out to me. So I was wondering if I could just go there for a little bit to let people
Fire away.
understand what went on and why things happened the way they did.
Yeah, fire away. I did jump a little bit. I think, notes are nice on paper, but then when you get going through it, sometimes you miss things. So I appreciate you bringing me back to base, Jim.
Sure. And but there's some things that I just think really aren't real public knowledge, especially for hunters that maybe started in the 1990s and don't know some of the history that went on. And like we talked about earlier, during the 70s and it is really the late 60s, early 70s. As we mentioned, a lot of times we were chasing populations with regulations. Numbers went up, we were liberal. Numbers went down, we were more restrictive. And there was always this question about, well, what effect does hunting really have on the population? And there were a lot of folks in the U.S. and Canada that really wanted to find out, even at that time, before we got into the adaptive harvest management stuff later. And their idea at the time was they wanted to go into what they called a stabilized regulations experiment. And I don't know if you're familiar with that at all or not, but essentially the idea was that if we held regulations pretty stable over a period of years, we'd recognize that the environment would fluctuate over that time. You give it 10 years, 12 years, something like that. And by decoupling the regulations from annual population status, we thought, even though it wasn't truly an experiment, we could better tease apart the effects of regulations versus the environment on annual changes in duck abundance. And we felt that if we could address that, or the people felt that if they could address that question, it would really move them down the road in terms of developing harvest regulations that were not only more appropriate, but more understandable to the hunting public out there. So they embarked on this in the mid 1970s. And the idea was, again, we're going to keep regulations pretty stable. We may have to tweak things just a little bit, but we aren't going to chase populations. We're going to try to keep things fairly consistent. The problem with that was that during the time that experiment was run, things were getting progressively drier on the prairies. And so whereas things looked pretty good wetland wise in the mid 1970s, late 1970s, things started to dry out and populations also went down. And I can remember watching the 1988 waterfowl status video where Raleigh Sparrow, who was the chief of the division or of the Office of Migratory Bird Management at the time, did the intro for it. And he was walking across a wetland that was bone dry. And it was a large emergent wetland. And he put the microphone down by the substrate, and you could just hear the bulrush and the cattail just crunching. There was no water there anywhere. So essentially, the pressure got to be so great with abundances of birds going down, everyone recognizing a drought, that they had to break away from the experiment. And because they had fairly liberal regulations up until 1988, when all the changes were made, the leadership in Washington felt that some fairly dramatic steps had to be taken. So that's why they went to a very restrictive package, and they did away with a lot of the special seasons and other special regulations that occurred at that time. So just to give your listenership kind of an understanding that there was a plan to try and understand things better. Unfortunately, the prairies and the precipitation cycle just didn't go along with us to help us work through that. And then on the other end, as we started coming out of that in 1994, the water started coming back. And then the debate was, okay, how much should we liberalize? And we really didn't have a good objective way for determining that either. So the federal personnel had their ideas about what the regulation should be, and they wanted to be a little more conservative because we were coming out of a drought period. The flyways had a different take. They wanted to be more liberal. They said, look, things are getting better. The birds are producing again. You should open it up some more. And that that impasse really resulted in something that we really didn't want happen, and that was Congress got involved. And we don't want that at any point in time. I hope that we as biologists and the hunters out there don't want that, because whether you agree with some of the decisions or not, you have to trust me that we're trying to make the best decisions we can based on the information we have. And when politics get involved, I think things can go sideways really fast.
For sure.
And so that's what happened coming out of that, and that's what led it ultimately to adaptive harvest management. And whenever you want to, we can talk about that a little bit, and how that all came about, and how it can be changed in the future. That it is truly adaptive. And,
well, yeah, I mean, that's where folks say adaptive harvest management isn't adaptive, but we've already moved from kind of the framework you talked about earlier into kind of integrated, population models, which is kind of like the next iteration of adaptive harvest management that helps make, those objective decisions. That's the biggest point, is that there's data in, there's data out that give you an expected, harvest from that. And then it gives you a framework of which you are in this liberal, moderate, or restrictive package. You get a harvest from that. It tells you what your population should be the next year based on what you expect for survival rate and reproductive rate of those birds. You see how well that matches, and you continue that cycle kind of over and over, and you learn from it at the same time. Because when the model tells you something different than what you expected, then you should be learning from the environment, what was different that gave you that kind of different message, that different wavelength there.
Yeah, so, and it gives you places then to focus maybe some efforts to try and understand that better down the road, so that you don't get surprises, if you will.
Right. And that's where, I continue to say, shoot them through the bottom, because we went through a low period in 2005 to 2008. I was in Mississippi during that. And goodness, I still shot a bunch of ducks. I found birds. It wasn't like the world was ending. And those ducks rebounded through 2015, 2018. I'm kicking some dates around that are close. And then we've been, declining, since that point. And I hope we stick with this kind of, liberal season with 6 ducks, because I think the birds are just going to pull right through that bottom. I think we, as I said, like, shoot them through the bottom. I don't feel like we're driving those duck populations. I think it's a nice balancing point, because there's lots of folks out there that think that we're harming the duck population, but the science really isn't showing that. Like, hen mallard harvest rate is, many percentage points below what we figure would even impact a population at this point. So, I mean, there is a tipping point when the habitat gets bad enough, right, Jim? But I don't know. There's not an indication that we're there yet. We might hit it, and we might be in a moderate package, but that makes sense. But it's all going to be an objective decision, we hope, and not, legislation, because that just throws us off kilter and doesn't help us learn, doesn't help hunters, doesn't really serve the resource in general, right?
Right. I agree. All for science and letting the data help us make the best decisions. But, we've talked about that a lot. And I think this is what was really important about adaptive harvest management, is that we not only looked at the biological side of things through our monitoring and, what survival rates and recruitment rates and harvest rates, all that was, but we also recognized that a huge part of the decision process is what you want to get out of management. And that was always fairly vague from leadership at both the state and the federal level. The goals and objectives were always like, well, to continue to offer hunting opportunity or to maintain duck populations. Well, those of us who have worked with this recognize that, well, opportunity can mean a lot of different things to different people. And you can sustain birds at very low populations, or you can sustain them at very high populations. And depending on how they react to harvest, you may adjust accordingly. But the problem was that those objectives for what you want to get out of management were never very well articulated, and certainly were not quantifiable. And I think that was the big leap that we made with adaptive harvest management, was to get people to understand that both the science about the birds and the understanding of what we want to get out of management have to be quantifiable, so that we have something to measure against, so that we can determine what's happening with the ducks and whether we're achieving the objectives that we want to out of management. Both of those points are critical. And so if there are people that are dissatisfied with the way things are going, one, you can look at the data, and like you said, if we aren't seeing dramatic changes in survival rates or recruitment rates or whatever, we may not be having much of an impact on the actual demographics of the birds, and maybe it's our objectives that aren't appropriately described. And so maybe that's what we need to go back and determine, okay, are the objectives that we've specified really what we want, or is it something different? And so I think, and that's why I think that adaptive harvest management is so strong, is because how can anyone come in and say you're making a bad decision when any part of that is adaptable if the management community can agree on it?
The thing that I see right now is that the sideboards of, like, a population that we're way under harvesting and a population that we're way over harvesting, like, we're easily within those sideboards to a large degree. And so when people say you haven't done anything, you haven't adapted, it's like, it is adaptable. We just haven't hit any of those major triggers yet, because we're actually probably being pretty conservative with the resource, I think, in general, more so than what I think a lot of people tend to think. Like, there was go ahead, sorry.
I'm sorry. I think that was one of the real wow moments, was when we went through all this modeling and we realized that mallards in particular could withstand a lot more harvest pressure than we thought they could.
Yeah.
Now, every species is different. They all have different harvest potentials, but particularly for mallards, which AHM was, based around, because that was where we had the best information. I think that was a real eye opener for people, that we could have pretty liberal seasons when conditions weren't real favorable on the breeding grounds, and maybe when populations were lower. They could still withstand that.
The other thing too, and I'll dig into this a little bit, is when you do the Lincoln estimators for mallards, it's like the continental population is actually twice what we because we're just counting a small portion of it. But mallards exist everywhere. I mean, the mallards I shoot in central New York, when it freezes, are coming out of the city. I'm shooting popcorn ducks, right? And nobody's there's a lot of those ducks that are just never counted in a survey that are part of the harvest as well. So I think there's like this, the mallard, if you look at other populations, they kind of tweak along, gadwall jump, shovelers jump, blue wings jump, so on and so forth. Some stuff bounces around, goes down a little bit, like redheads, canvasbacks, but mallards are like wildly fluctuating. And that's just because when the prairies get like those really ephemeral wetlands, those really productive wetlands, when the water comes back after a dry period, mallards just exploit the heck out of that. They're just very good at that, right? But they continue to exist kind of everywhere in some like base line that we don't even count. And so that's what I always think, is I really just think they can absorb more of this because they've got that buffer of that other stuff. And then when their numbers go nuts, we have amazing seasons and we're probably nowhere near affecting their population. When they're low, we might be getting borderline, but no, there's no indication that we've ever had, a major impact. Locally, yes, you always can affect a population locally, but at a larger scale, we're not, we're not detecting it. So yeah, it's a good point, Jim. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right, we've had you on the line for a while now, and
I will say,
do you have other highlights you want to hit on?
No, well, you had initially asked me before I went into my little history lesson there about where we are with wetlands now and what I think
Very good. Thank you for bringing me back to base again.
so, so if you want me to continue along those lines, I do have some ideas.
Fire away. Yeah, like you're a pile of information, and we're not going to deny you your time, buddy. So go for it.
Okay. Well, if I recall, the question was, we're entering or we're in somewhat of a dry period right now, and where are we in this cycle relative to, say 20 years ago, 30 years ago?
Mid 80s, the bad stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, when the last period that we went through, and remember, we went through that in the 60s as well. There was a dry period as well. So we've been through these before, and it's typical, and actually, it's, as you know, it's needed for prairie ecosystems to really be productive, is to go through periods of dryness to regenerate vegetation and all the food resources that go with that. Yeah. So right now, just the natural cycle, I think, is probably occurring, and it's not too concerning to me in and of itself. But what is more concerning is, some of the regulations that are going on out there relative to protection of wetlands. And so what is the potential of those lawsuits that have been adjudicated and agricultural policies and so on for things to return the way they were, when precipitation does come back? And it feels almost like we're kind of in a stair step, that as time goes on, even with increased precipitation, the base isn't there anymore to hold wetlands. So I'm really concerned that some of the other things that are going on with all the demands on the landscape out there, we may have more problems in the future getting back to where we were. And I did happen to look at the latest status of wetlands report that was just published last year, and it covers the period 2009 to 19. And what they stated in there was that vegetated wetlands, which are the ones that are really important for waterfowl, the loss of those had increased by 50% compared to the previous 10-year period. Now, overall wetland loss wasn't as high because there was an increase in non-vegetated wetlands. But those aren't nearly as useful to waterfowl. So I think it depends a lot on what we're losing over time. Water, not all water is the same. So ultimately, the question is, can all the habitat restoration efforts that are out there through the North American, through Ducks Unlimited, through all those other efforts out there, are we going to be able to maintain things, or are we just going to slow the rate of decline over time? Is that the best we can hope for? I don't know. I don't have the answer.
No crystal ball. No crystal ball, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the duck productivity is obviously critically dependent on that habitat base out there. So I really don't know what we have for the future, but I do know that at least as far as the regulation setting process, again, as we've talked about, that out of the different things that I experienced over my career, the AHM process is probably the best able to adapt to those changes over time and still give good, solid recommendations for what those regulations should be, given the changes that will occur, to the extent that we can understand how those changes are occurring.
Very good, Jim, and I appreciate you backing up my ADHD. It doesn't always make me the best host, so I do appreciate you keeping me on track with my podcast. So I derailed you a little bit. No,
I want to make sure you got back to where you want.
You're fine, and we focused on harvest regulations, but what I find that hunters want to do is feel like the lever they can pull is say, we need less days, we need smaller bag limits. And the reality is that we don't a lot of folks feel helpless when it comes to the habitat type stuff, the wetland loss, the grassland loss, but that is all policy. It's the people you vote for. It's the farm bill, and you have a voice as a duck hunter in how that stuff happens. And my comment always is focus on those things, and focus on those more than you are focusing on the harvest regulations, because you are probably going to have more of an impact long term for the numbers of ducks you see over your duck blind at southern latitudes by focusing on those things that just keep that landscape and those ducks with us in the first place, over thinking about tweaking your harvest regulations, which we did for what? Let's just go with 100 years. And it might not have mattered, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I would add to that, they have, the hunters have a critical voice in that. They also have a voice that should be heard in terms of our monitoring programs out there. As federal budgets get cut, wildlife, frankly, isn't on the top of a lot of politicians' lists. And so our monitoring has suffered over the last couple decades, not to the point where it's broken, but it's bent quite a bit. Mm-hmm. We've lost some surveys. We've had to cut back on others. And I think it's very important for the hunters to understand that it's really that monitoring data that gives you as much opportunity as is possible out there. And if we start losing that capability to monitor the critters out there, we'll have less information. There's the chance for more bias in the results and less precision. So we aren't as sure of the system as we'd like to be. And so it could result in more conservative regulations, and certainly could result in more challenges by outside interests who may want to not see as much hunting that's out there. So whenever they have the opportunity to advocate in whatever venue they have, let folks know that how important this is for their chosen recreational activities. And I just feel that's really important. The waterfowl program, migratory bird program as a whole, has just done amazing things in the last 100 years in what we can do with waterfowl monitoring information. And we are probably at the apex of groups that are out there that understand what's going on with the animals under their, or wildlife under their charge.
Yeah, the breeding waterfowl population survey is the largest wildlife survey and the envy of the world. And right. To lose that monitoring tool to make decisions would be appalling. And you kind of said it very well, and I'll summarize it, is that if we don't have that information, we go to a conservative decision, which is probably reduced seasons. And because if we don't have the information vital information we need to make a decision appropriately, then we ratchet back to be conservative to ensure we don't hurt the resource. So losing monitoring potentially loses opportunity for sure, right, Jim?
Right. Yeah, and we always hear about citizen science and the great things that citizen science is doing for particularly the non-game species out there. I think all the hunters should realize that they have been participating in citizen science since the 1920s by reporting a bird band, by participating in the harvest surveys, the parts collection surveys. And that's all critically important, and their participation is critically important for that information that we get. It was kind of scary. I still go to the Central Flyway Wing Bee each year. They invite me back, and I help out and get to meet people that or talk with people that I used to work with during my career. But we have gone in the Central Flyway from about 25,000 parts that we annually looked at. That's duck wings and goose tail fans back as recently as probably 15 years ago, down to, I think the last year's count was only around 10,000 parts. So we've dropped by more than 50%. And I don't know all the reasons. I've talked to the Harvest Survey folks about it. But part of it may be just folks don't want to participate anymore, or they don't really understand the program and they're hesitant to participate in it. But that's another thing that I would encourage all the hunters to do, is that if you shoot a banded bird, if you're selected for the harvest survey or the parts collection survey, please participate. That information is critical for us to help make us help us make better management decisions. So that's another thing that I would ask of them.
Yeah, when I go to the Duck Symposium once every 3 years, like 300 so of my best friends, new students that I meet, the really impactful talks almost all use those data streams in some shape, manner, or form. When we talk about the trajectory of waterfowl populations, how waterfowl harvest and waterfowl habitat play a role, those data streams are continuously used by scientists to inform the decision makers. The scientists, like, I'd like to also, point this out, that the academics that produce this stuff aren't making decisions. They they hand it off to folks, right?
Right.
And then there are folks in Fish and Wildlife Service that are building models and doing the science stuff that then are used in decision making. But a lot of this stuff comes from academia, which is separate from the decision making model as well. But the reality is that without those monitoring data, half those talks and that good information we have to manage these populations properly just isn't there, Jim. So
right. Agreed.
So I had a final question on a broad topic of if you could improve the duck hunting experience and satisfaction for the duck hunting folks across what at the FowlWeather Podcast we call Duck Country USA. What would that improvement be? But I think you was that it? Like, hey, participate, or was there something else you wanted to nail down?
No, I think that's it. I mean, between what you said about helping give a voice to habitat programs, I think it's critical to continue to voice support for our monitoring programs and to participate in them whenever you have that opportunity. Because to me, satisfaction, means so many different things to different people. For some, it's going out and seeing a lot of ducks. For others, it's being able to shoot a certain number of ducks. For others, it's just being out with friends, family, or whatever, out in nature and doing it. So it's kind of hard for me to answer, but I can say that if we want to continue to enjoy the waterfowl resource the way we have in the past and hope to in the future, those three things that we just talked about, I think are critically important for us to be able to continue to provide that service.
Yeah. Amen. So people keep after it, keep participating, promote the programs that we have because they work. And Jim and I talked about government efficiency or inefficiency before. And, I'll admit that there's government inefficiency, but man, the Office of Migratory Bird Management budget has been frozen for 10 years plus. And there's no way to still function without becoming more efficient. And these people are extremely passionate. So please get behind them. Please support, your waterfowl community out there and the folks trying to do and definitely doing good work for you. I mean, they're in the marshes, the fields, the woods, the lakes, wherever you travel. They're out there with you. I mean, these folks are diehards too. So just like Jim. So appreciate you, Jim, being here, and all the best in your continued pursuits. Really appreciate the insight, the history, and thank you for coming on the FowlWeather Podcast.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I enjoyed talking with you, Mike.